I think I hold the world record for having the police called on me for refusing to join an HOA that didn't legally exist. It's a niche category, I admit, but I'm proud of my work. The most satisfying part wasn't even the eventual, glorious implosion of the wannabe tyrant's little kingdom. No, the truly priceless moment was the look on her face when she realized the quiet, unassuming retiree she'd been tormenting for weeks wasn't just some guy who liked planting roses. The look on her face when she watched a local cop's entire demeanor shift from boredom to respectful attention after I showed him my credentials. That was a vintage I could bottle and savor for years. So, grab a seat, maybe some popcorn, drop a comment, and let me know where in the world you're watching from, because I promise you, this story of suburban warfare gets absolutely crazy. It's a testament to the fact that when you push a man who spent 30 years investigating complex financial fraud for the federal government, you're not going to get the reaction you expect. It all started, as these things so often do, with a search for peace. After 3 decades of chasing sophisticated tax cheats and money launderers for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, all I wanted was a quiet place to decompress. A life where the most complicated document I had to analyze was the assembly manual for a new grill. My wife and I found the perfect spot, a lovely, established neighborhood called Lakeview Estates. It had mature trees, well-kept but unique homes, and a distinct lack of the cookie-cutter sameness that screams, oppressive homeowners association. This wasn't a guess. It was a verified fact. In my line of work, you learn to do your due diligence. I personally pulled the county records and the state incorporation filings. There was no HOA. No covenants, no restrictions beyond standard city ordinances. It was, in a word, perfect. We moved in, and the first few weeks were blissful. We met a few of the neighbors. There were the Garcias, a young couple 2 doors down, who seemed a little timid but genuinely sweet. And there was Arthur, a widower in his late 70s who had lived in his house since it was built 40 years ago. He was a man of few words, but he had a workshop in his garage that smelled wonderfully of sawdust and oil, and he gave me a cutting from his prize-winning tomato plant. It felt like a real community, a place where people managed to maintain their property and be civil to one another without a board of unelected busybodies telling them what color to paint their front door. Then Beatrice Vanderbilt Hayes came calling. She didn't just knock on the door, it felt more like she materialized on my porch, an omen in beige linen. She was a woman who was clearly wealthy but had somehow missed the lesson on taste. Everything was expensive, but nothing quite matched. She wore a gaudy gold watch that was too large for her wrist and sunglasses that could have doubled as a welding mask. She arrived not in a sensible sedan, but in a gleaming white Range Rover that she'd parked just a little too close to my driveway, a subtle assertion of dominance. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of syrupy condescension that only the truly entitled can master. She didn't offer a handshake. Instead, she extended a perfectly manicured hand holding a glossy, trifold brochure. "I'm Beatrice Hayes. I'm the president of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association, and I've come to welcome you to the community and get you your paperwork." I took the brochure. The front read, "Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association, preserving our community, protecting our investments." It was professionally printed, with a stock photo of a smiling, ethnically diverse family that I was certain had never set foot in our state, let alone our neighborhood. Inside was a list of rules that made my blood run cold. There were regulations on the acceptable species of flowers one could plant, the specific model of mailbox required, a steel at 350, available only through the HOA, of course, and a color palette for exterior paint that consisted of 15 nearly identical shades of taupe. My internal alarms, honed by years of sniffing out fraud, were screaming. I'd seen shell corporations with more substance than this. "An HOA?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "That's interesting. The county records didn't show one registered for this plat." A flicker of something annoyance, panic, crossed her face before being plastered over with a brittle smile. "Oh, we're a private community association. It's a legacy agreement. It's how we maintain our beautiful standards," she chirped, gesturing vaguely at the neighborhood. "The annual dues are $1,800, but there's just a one-time $500 initiation and records fee to get you started. I have the forms right here." She held up a clipboard with a pen attached by a little beaded chain. She genuinely expected me to sign up and write a check on the spot. I looked from her expectant face to the absurd brochure, then back. The audacity was almost impressive. She wasn't just a power-tripping HOA president. She was a power-tripping president of an HOA that was, as far as I could tell, a complete fabrication. She had built a phantom government on our quiet little street and declared herself queen. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes," I said, handing the brochure back to her. "I appreciate the information, but I'll have to decline." Her smile didn't just vanish, it curdled. "Decline?" she repeated, as if I'd just announced my intention to raise livestock in my front yard. "I don't think you understand. Membership isn't really optional. It's what everyone does. It's for the good of the community. I'm sure my wife and I will be excellent neighbors without being part of your association," I said, my voice still polite but firm. "But thank you for stopping by." I started to close the door, but she put a hand out to stop it. "You'll be hearing from us," she said, her voice now stripped of all its artificial sweetness. It was flat, cold, and heavy with threat. As I closed and locked the door, I looked at the brochure she'd shoved back into my hand. This wasn't just a case of a nosy neighbor. This was organized, premeditated, and had all the hallmarks of a classic long con, just on a ridiculously small, suburban scale. My quiet retirement, it seemed, was officially over. I wasn't just a resident anymore, I was an investigator, and I had just found my next case right on my own doorstep. The game was on. A week passed in deceptive quiet. I half expected Beatrice to show up with a homemade battering ram, but all was still. The Garcias gave me a nervous wave whenever they saw me, their eyes darting towards Beatrice's house, as if afraid she'd see them interacting with the local pariah. Arthur, however, gave me a slow, appreciative nod one afternoon as I was weeding a flower bed. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a vote of confidence from the neighborhood's elder statesman. He knew what was going on, and he approved of my defiance. The ceasefire ended precisely 8 days after our initial meeting. Beatrice Hayes returned, this time without the pretense of a welcome wagon. She caught me as I was taking the trash cans to the curb. Her Range Rover idled silently behind her like a loyal, oversized predator. She was holding her clipboard again, tapping it impatiently with a long, blood-red fingernail. "I'm here for your signed membership forms and the initiation fee," she announced, foregoing any greeting. "Good morning, Mrs. Hayes," I said, my voice relentlessly pleasant. "As I mentioned last week, we won't be joining your association." "This is not a request," she snapped, her carefully constructed facade of the benevolent matriarch crumbling into dust. "Every other respectable homeowner in Lakeview Estates is a member in good standing. Your refusal to participate reflects poorly on the entire street. It lowers property values." "Does it?" I asked, genuinely curious about her bizarre logic. I would have thought my consistently mowed lawn and lack of rusting vehicles would have a more direct impact on property values than not paying dues to a private club I don't wish to be a part of. Her face tightened, the little muscles around her jaw pulsed. I had dealt with men who had stolen millions of dollars from pension funds and orchestrated international tax shelters. Their tells were all different, but the core emotion was the same: the incandescent rage of an egotist being told no. Beatrice had it in spades. "This is your final warning," she hissed. "Comply, or you will find that this is a very uncomfortable place to live." She spun on her heel and marched back to her urban assault vehicle, leaving the threat hanging in the air. The very next morning, the passive-aggressive phase of her campaign began. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a small laminated card. Laminated. The woman had her own laminator for crafting instruments of petty tyranny. The note, printed in an infuriatingly cheerful font, read, "Friendly reminder from the LVEAA. Grass height should not exceed 3 inches. Your lawn is currently measuring an estimated 3.25 inches. See Guideline 7B for details." I stared at the card. I walked over to my lawn. It was immaculate. I'm a retiree. Keeping a neat lawn is practically a competitive sport. The idea that she had come onto my property, likely with a ruler, to measure my grass, was so profoundly unhinged that I almost had to respect the dedication. I took a photo of the note with my phone, dated it, and filed it away in a new folder on my computer I'd labeled The Beatrice Project. Over the next 2 weeks, the laminated notes became a regular occurrence. One appeared on my front door. The placement of your garden gnome is in violation of the approved decorative item list, see Appendix C. Gnomes, while charming, must be positioned at least 5 feet from any public walkway. Another was taped to my new mailbox, which was a perfectly normal USPS-approved mailbox, not her 350 monstrosity. This mailbox model is not in compliance with LVEHA Regulation 11D. Please remedy this within 7 days to avoid further action. Each note was photographed, documented, and saved. I was building a case file out of sheer habit. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to do some light canvassing. I caught Mrs. Garcia watering her petunias and struck up a conversation. After a few minutes of small talk, I gently broached the subject. That HOA, is it really mandatory? She physically shrank. She looked over her shoulder at Beatrice's house, a 2-story beige fortress that loomed over the street. When we moved in a year ago, she told us it was. She whispered, her voice strained. She was part of the welcome. Our realtor didn't say anything, and we were new to the area. We didn't want to make waves. We pay the $150 every month. $150 a month? I repeated, doing the math. That was $1,800 a year, exactly what she'd quoted me. What does it pay for? Mrs. Garcia shrugged helplessly. She says it's for landscaping the common areas and community events. She had that big sign put up at the neighborhood entrance. And she throws a big 4th of July party every year at her house. She paused. We went the first year. It was awkward. It felt more like it was for her friends. We haven't gone back. This was better than I thought. A slush fund. Later that day, I saw Arthur tinkering with his lawnmower and wandered over. Arthur, I said, how long has this HOA business been going on? He wiped his hands on a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked me in the eye. About 5 years, he grumbled, ever since she moved in. Before that, for 35 years, this was just a neighborhood. We looked out for each other. If someone's lawn got long, it was because they were sick, and one of us would just go mow it for them. Then she showed up with her brochures and her big city ideas, tried to get me to pay. I told her where she could file her paperwork. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. She sends me nasty letters every few months. I use them to start the charcoal in my grill. So, I had my confirmation. This was a one-woman operation, preying on new residents and those who were too conflict-averse to push back. The final piece of the puzzle I needed before things inevitably escalated was a direct confrontation on the legal issue. I got my chance the following Saturday. I was out front, clearing some old, overgrown azaleas from a flower bed, when she descended upon me. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, marching right up to the edge of my lawn. "Good morning, Beatrice. I'm doing some gardening," I said calmly. "You can't just remove established landscaping. Any changes to your property's flora require pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee," she snapped. I finally dropped the polite act. It was time to draw a line in the sand. "Beatrice, there is no Architectural Review Committee because there is no homeowners association," I said, my voice level and clear. "I have personally checked the official property records with Wake County. I've searched the North Carolina Secretary of State's database for registered corporations. The Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association does not legally exist. It is a fiction you created." For the first time, she looked genuinely thrown. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. I had called her bluff in the most direct way possible. I had stated a verifiable legal fact that completely undermined her entire platform. Her recovery, however, was swift, and it was furious. "It is a private agreement," she shrieked, her voice rising in pitch and volume. "A covenant between neighbors. You are undermining this entire community with your arrogance. You will regret this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." She was practically vibrating with rage. As she stormed back to her house, I knew I had pushed the situation past the point of no return. The notes and verbal warnings were over. She had been publicly challenged and exposed as a fraud. even if only to an audience of one. Her next move would be a significant escalation. I didn't know what it would be, but I went inside and made sure my old credentials were in my wallet, just in case. My prediction of an escalation didn't take long to come true. I decided that since Beatrice was so invested in my landscaping, I might as well give her something to really fixate on. My wife had always wanted a small decorative border around the main flower bed in the front yard. Not a fence, really, just a little knee-high, wrought iron-style border to separate the mulch from the grass. It was tasteful, completely compliant with all city codes, and well within my property lines. It was also, I suspected, the perfect bait. I spent a Saturday morning installing it. It took about 2 hours. I wasn't even finished. I was still tapping the last section into place with a rubber mallet when the white Range Rover screeched to a halt in front of my house. Beatrice practically vaulted out of the driver's seat. She was wearing some sort of tennis outfit, despite the fact that our neighborhood had no tennis courts, and she was brandishing her now infamous HOA brochure like a holy text. "What is that?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the decorative border. Her voice carried across the quiet street. A few curtains twitched in neighboring windows. The Garcias, who were outside playing with their toddler, quickly scooped him up and scurried inside. "It's a fence, Beatrice," I said, not even bothering to look up from my work. "That is an unapproved material. It's an unapproved height. It's an unapproved design. All fencing requires a permit and a variance from the board," she yelled, her voice cracking with fury. She was actually marching onto my lawn now, stomping through the very grass she'd accused me of letting grow a quarter of an inch too long. "Beatrice, for the last time," I said, finally straightening up and looking her directly in the eye. "There is no board. This is my property, and you are currently trespassing. I suggest you return to the sidewalk." This was it. This was the moment her brain simply short-circuited. The combination of my defiance, my calm demeanor, and the public nature of the confrontation was more than her carefully controlled world could handle. Her face went from red to a blotchy purple. "Threatening me," she sputtered. "You are threatening me, and you are destroying property values with this hideous monstrosity." She whipped out her phone, her fingers jabbing at the screen. "I am calling the police," she announced, as if she were calling in an airstrike. "We'll see what the law has to say about this." I heard her speaking to the 911 dispatcher in a high-pitched, frantic voice. "Yes, my neighbor is threatening me. He's building an illegal structure in direct violation of our binding community covenants. He's being aggressive, and I fear for my safety." The sheer, breathtaking dishonesty of it was something to behold. I had spent my career dealing with liars, but they were usually sophisticated, high-level criminals. Beatrice's lies were clumsy, brutish, and born of pure, unadulterated ego. I sighed, picked up my mallet, and walked back to my garage. I put my tools away, went inside, and poured myself a glass of iced tea. Then, I sat in the chair by the front window and waited. About 15 minutes later, a local police cruiser pulled up. 2 officers got out, a senior, weary-looking officer and a younger one who still had a bit of idealistic energy. They looked like they were already tired of this call before it had even begun. Beatrice descended upon them like they were the liberating army. "Officers, thank God you're here," she gushed, putting on a masterful performance of a damsel in distress. "This man," she said, pointing dramatically at my front door, "has been harassing me for weeks. He is refusing to comply with the legal covenants of our homeowners association, which I am the president of. And when I tried to speak to him about this illegal fence, he became aggressive, and I genuinely feared for my well-being." The senior officer looked from her theatrical display to my perfectly normal house and the tiny, inoffensive garden border. His expression was one of profound resignation. He walked up my driveway and knocked on the door. I opened it immediately. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on here?" he asked, his voice flat and non-committal. "Good afternoon, officer," I said calmly. "I was installing a small decorative border in my flower bed on my own property. This woman, Mrs. Hayes, came onto my lawn and began shouting at me. I asked her to leave. She then called you." "He's lying," Beatrice squawked from the sidewalk. "He knows the rules. I am the president of the HOA." The officer turned his head slightly. "Ma'am, please let me handle this." He turned back to me. "Sir, are you aware of an HOA here, officer?" I said, keeping my voice low and respectful. "To the best of my knowledge, and based on my own search of public records, no such legal entity as the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association exists. I believe this is a civil matter at best, and one that Mrs. Hayes initiated by trespassing on my property to harass me." Beatrice scoffed loudly. "He's just making things up. I have the bylaws right here," she shouted, waving her clipboard. The officer sighed, the sound of a man who would rather be anywhere else. "Sir, do you have some identification on you?" "Of course," I said. I pulled out my wallet. I handed him my North Carolina driver's license. As he took it, I let my wallet fall open just enough for him to see my other ID, the one right behind the license slot. It was my retired credentials. The gold badge and the formal identification card reading, United States Treasury, Criminal Investigation. I didn't say a word about it, but his eyes flicked down to it, then back up to my face. The change was instantaneous and palpable. His posture straightened. The weary boredom in his eyes was replaced by a sharp, professional focus. He was no longer dealing with some random suburban homeowner in a petty squabble. He was dealing with a fellow traveler from the world of law and order, a senior one at that. He looked from my credentials to me, then over his shoulder at the still ranting Beatrice Hayes. A look of complete and utter comprehension dawned on his face. He knew exactly what was happening now. He knew who was telling the truth and who was running a scam. He handed my license back to me with a nod. "Thank you, sir." He then turned and walked directly to Beatrice. His entire tone had shifted. It was no longer placating. It was firm, official, and utterly dismissive of her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn, "this is a civil dispute. If, as he says, there is no legally registered HOA, then it isn't even that. It's a neighbor dispute that you started by coming onto his property and refusing to leave. Furthermore, calling 911 for a non-emergency like a disagreement over garden decorations is a misuse of emergency services. I strongly suggest you go back to your own home and cease this behavior immediately." Beatrice's face was a priceless work of art. Her jaw was slack, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. She had called in the authorities to smite her enemy, and they had, in no uncertain terms, taken his side. She watched as the officer gave me a respectful nod, got back in his car, and drove away. Her carefully constructed authority had been publicly demolished by a real authority figure. Her little fiefdom had been invaded by reality. She stood frozen on the sidewalk, her face a mask of pure, impotent fury, staring at me as if I had just set fire to her castle right in front of her. The war had just begun, but I had decisively won the first major battle. The departure of the police car left a vacuum of silence on the street, broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower. Beatrice stood there for another 10 seconds, motionless, her face a storm of conflicting emotions, shock, humiliation, and a deep, simmering rage. Then, without another word, she turned and stalked back to her Range Rover, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows of her own house. The spell was broken. Word of the incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The Garcias, who had witnessed the entire drama from their living room window, came over that evening under the cover of dusk, looking like spies on a secret mission. "That was incredible," Mr. Garcia said, his eyes wide. "We saw the whole thing. The way that cop talked to her at the end, he totally shut her down. She told us, when we moved in, that if we ever had a problem, we should call her, not the police, Mrs. Garcia added, her voice a hushed whisper. "She said she had a special relationship with the local precinct. I guess not." "She has a special relationship with her own delusions," I replied dryly. "Listen, you mentioned you've been paying her. Do you happen to have any of your old canceled checks?" They exchanged a look. "I think so," Mr. Garcia said. "We do most of our banking online, but we wrote physical checks for her. She insisted on it." Of course she did. Physical checks are harder to trace in bulk than electronic transfers and create a paper trail that can be easily lost. An hour later, he emailed me scans of 6 canceled checks, front and back. And there it was, the smoking gun I knew I'd find. The The checks were made out not to Lakeview Estates HOA, but directly to Beatrice V. Hayes. The endorsement stamps on the back showed they were all deposited into a personal checking account at a major national bank. She wasn't even bothering with the pretense of a separate account. She was commingling the funds. To an IRS investigator, this was like a flashing neon sign that says fraud and tax evasion happening here. This was no longer about just getting her off my back. This was about justice for the people she'd been extorting for 5 years. This was about dismantling her corrupt little regime, piece by piece. My retirement was officially on hold. I was back on the job, and Beatrice Hayes was my new target. I fired up my old laptop, created a new encrypted folder, and began to build my case in earnest. My first step was a deep dive into her finances, or what I could piece together from the outside. With the Garcias' help, I discreetly made contact with 3 other families on the street who admitted to paying the dues. 2 of them were elderly couples who just paid to avoid the confrontation. The third was a young family like the Garcias, who had been similarly duped when they moved in. With their information, I could now conservatively estimate her illicit income. She had at least 12 households paying her $150 a month. That was $1,800 a month or $21,600 a year. For 5 years, that was over $100,000. All of it paid directly to her, and I was willing to bet my pension that not a single penny of it had ever been declared as income to the IRS or the state. Next, I investigated her claimed expenses. The landscaping of common areas was her biggest justification. The only common area was a 20-foot-long strip of grass on either side of the entrance sign she'd installed. I called the very landscaping company whose truck I saw there once a month. Posing as a new resident, I asked for a quote to mow a similarly sized patch of lawn. The owner laughed and said he'd do it for $30 a month as part of a larger neighborhood deal. So, of her supposed $1,800 in monthly income, a generous estimate of her primary expense was $30. The Community Security Patrol was even more of a joke. Arthur, the old-timer, told me it was Beatrice's brother-in-law, a man named Dale, who drove a beat-up Ford F-150. He'd cruise through the neighborhood once on a Friday night, a fact I confirmed myself the following week. He wasn't providing security, he was just driving through. Then, there was the sign itself. A quick call to the city's planning and zoning department confirmed my suspicion. No permit had ever been issued for the "Welcome to Lakeview Estates" sign. It was an illegal structure on the public right-of-way. The final piece was the parties, her lavish community events. I had a long chat with one of the elderly couples who had been paying her. They had attended her first 4th of July party. Oh, it was a very fancy affair, the wife told me. Catered food, a bartender, but we hardly knew anyone. It was all her friends from the country club. There were maybe 6 of us from the actual neighborhood. We felt very out of place, so we never went back. So, there it was. Beatrice Hayes was using the money she extorted from her neighbors to fund her own lavish lifestyle, subsidize her personal landscaping, and throw parties for her wealthy friends, all under the guise of community improvement. It was a textbook case of fraud. Over the next week, I compiled my findings into a single, comprehensive dossier. It was a thing of beauty, if I do say so myself. It included 1. A detailed timeline of her harassment against me, complete with photos of the laminated notes. 2. Signed, notarized statements from the Garcias and 2 other families about the fraudulent claims she made to induce payment. 3. High-resolution scans of the canceled checks, clearly showing payment to her personal account. 4. Official records from the county and state confirming the non-existence of the HOA. 5. A printout from the city's planning department showing the lack of a permit for her sign. Lou. A meticulously detailed financial analysis, estimating her 5-year income from the scheme, her minimal legitimate expenses, and a conservative calculation of her likely federal and state tax liabilities, including penalties for fraud and failure to file. It was a multi-page spreadsheet that would have made my old boss weep with joy. My first instinct was to just mail the entire package to the IRS tip line and the state attorney general and let them have at it. But that felt too impersonal. it wouldn't give the neighbors the closure they deserved. It wouldn't publicly dismantle the myth of Beatrice Hayes. She had ruled through public intimidation. She needed to be brought down through public humiliation. I went back to the Garcias with a plan. We're going to call a neighborhood meeting, I told them. Not an HOA meeting, a meeting of the residents of Lakeview Estates to discuss community improvement and neighborhood affairs. We drafted a simple, friendly flyer. It was deliberately neutral, talking about things like a potential neighborhood watch program and planning a real community block party. We made no mention of Beatrice or the HOA. We knew she wouldn't be able to resist. A public meeting about neighborhood business was her stage, her arena. She would see it as an attempt to usurp her power and would undoubtedly show up to assert her dominance. We printed 50 copies. Together, my new emboldened allies and I walked the neighborhood, placing a flyer on every single door, including Beatrice's. I tucked hers neatly under the handle of her front door. As I walked away, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The stage was set, the evidence was gathered. I had booked the small meeting room at the local library for the following Tuesday evening. Beatrice Hayes thought she was coming to a neighborhood meeting. In reality, she was walking into her own tribunal. The meeting room at the library was set up for 30 people, and to my surprise, nearly every chair was filled. Word had clearly gotten around that something was happening. I saw faces I barely recognized, people who had likely been quietly enduring Beatrice's reign for years. Arthur was there, sitting in the front row, a stoic expression on his face. The Garcias and the other families who had spoken to me sat together, a small block of nervous but determined resistance. And then, precisely at 7 o'clock, Beatrice Hayes made her grand entrance. She was dressed in a crisp white pantsuit, looking every bit the corporate executive ready for a hostile takeover. Her meek husband, a man who looked permanently apologetic for the space he occupied, trailed a few steps behind her, carrying a heavy-looking leather briefcase which I presumed was full of her nonsensical bylaws and laminated notes. She surveyed the room with a look of smug satisfaction, clearly assuming this large turnout was a testament to her influence. She strode to the front of the room, ready to seize control. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice booming with unearned authority. "While this meeting was not officially sanctioned by the LVEAA, I am pleased to see so many of you taking an active interest in our community's governance. Now, the first item on my agenda." "Excuse me," I said, standing up from my seat in the second row. My voice was calm but carried through the room. "Mrs. Hayes, you are not running this meeting. I am." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Beatrice turned to me, her eyes flashing with fury. "And who do you think you are?" she spat. "I'm your neighbor," I replied simply. "The one you tried to have arrested for planting a rosebush." That got a few gasps and some nervous laughter. I called this meeting because it's time we, the actual residents of Lakeview Estates, had a frank discussion about what's been going on in our neighborhood. I walked to the front of the room, where I had a laptop connected to a projector. Beatrice stood her ground for a moment, looking like she might physically try to stop me, but her husband gently tugged on her arm, and she reluctantly stepped to the side, crossing her arms and radiating contempt. "Thank you all for coming," I began again, addressing the room. "For the last 5 years, many of you have been told that you are members of a mandatory homeowners association. You've been paying dues and following a strict set of rules under that assumption. I'm here tonight to present you with some facts." With a click of the mouse, the first slide appeared on the screen behind me. It was a screenshot of the Wake County Property Records search page, with Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association typed into the search box. Below it, in large red letters, were the results. No records found. I let the image hang there for a moment. You could feel the atmosphere in the room shift from curiosity to shock. "This is a lie. It's a doctored image," Beatrice yelled from the side. "It is not," I said calmly, "and anyone with a smartphone can go to the county's public website right now and verify it for themselves. The simple legal fact is that no such HOA exists." I clicked to the next slide, a screenshot from the North Carolina Secretary of State's Business Registry. Same search, same result, no records found. "For 5 years," I continued, my voice steady and clear, Beatrice Hayes has been operating a fraudulent organization. She has used intimidation and harassment to enforce rules that have no legal standing. The next slide showed a collage of the laminated notes she had left me. She has issued fines and warnings based on bylaws that she wrote herself, for an entity that is a complete fiction. I then moved to the financial portion of my presentation. This was my home turf. Many of you have been paying Mrs. Hayes $150 a month. You were told this was for community expenses. Let's see where that money really went. The next slide showed a high-resolution scan of one of the Garcia's canceled checks. As you can see, these checks were not made out to an HOA. They were made out directly to Beatrice Hayes personally. Another click. And they were deposited, as you can see from the endorsement stamp, into her personal bank account. Beatrice was now white as a sheet. Her husband was tugging on her sleeve, whispering frantically to her, but she stood frozen, staring at the screen as if it were an executioner's warrant. I put up my financial analysis spreadsheet. Based on statements from multiple residents, I conservatively estimate that Mrs. Hayes has collected over $100,000 over the past 5 years. After accounting for her expenses, $30 a month for mowing, and the occasional cost of printing flyers for her private parties, we are left with a significant amount of personal, undeclared income. I let that phrase hang in the air. Undeclared income. Now, I'm just a quiet retiree, I said, turning to look directly at Beatrice. But in my old job, we had a name for this sort of thing. It's a combination of wire fraud, mail fraud, and, most seriously, felony tax evasion. I paused, letting the weight of that last phrase settle into the silent room. My professional background, you see, was with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. This is exactly the kind of case I used to build for federal prosecution. The collective gasp in the room was audible. Beatrice looked as if she'd been struck by lightning. Her entire campaign of terror was based on a presumed authority she never had, wielded against people she assumed were ignorant and weak. She never, in her wildest dreams, imagined that the quiet man in the house with the unapproved garden gnome was a seasoned federal investigator who specialized in exactly her brand of financial crime. She started sputtering, "Slander, lies. You can't prove any of this." Arthur, the old-timer, stood up slowly from the front row. "I can," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I've lived here 40 years. There was never an HOA. She started it. She tried to bully me, too." Then Mrs. Garcia stood up, trembling but resolute. "She told my husband and me that membership was mandatory when we bought our house. We paid because we were afraid of her." One by one, 3 other people stood up and told similar stories. Beatrice Hayes's empire of beige tyranny, built on lies and intimidation, crumbled to dust in less than 10 minutes. Finally, I clicked to my last slide. It was simple, with just 2 bullet points. "So, Beatrice," I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, "here is where we stand. You have 2 options. Option 1, you will provide a full, audited accounting of every single dollar you collected under the guise of the LVEHA. You will then issue full restitution, with interest, to every resident from whom you took money. You will also pay for the removal of the illegal sign at the neighborhood entrance. And finally, you will sign a legally binding cease and desist agreement, which an attorney friend of mine was kind enough to draft, promising to never again represent yourself as any kind of neighborhood authority. If you do all of that, we, as a community, might be persuaded to consider this unfortunate matter closed." I let her stare at the first option. Then, I continued. "Option 2 is much simpler. This entire dossier," I said, holding up a thick binder from my briefcase, "along with a full summary of tonight's witness testimonies, will be hand-delivered tomorrow morning to the IRS Criminal Investigation Field Office in Raleigh, the North Carolina Attorney General's Office, and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service for mail fraud. They will be very, very interested in your undeclared $100,000. The choice is yours." Beatrice stared at me, her face a ruin. The smugness, the condescension, the rage, it was all gone, replaced by the cold, stark terror of a cornered animal. She knew she was beaten. She was utterly and completely destroyed, not by force, but by the very thing she pretended to represent: rules, documents, and evidence. Without a word, she turned and, with her husband practically dragging her, fled the room. Within a week, refund checks began appearing in mailboxes. They were sent via certified mail, and they included handwritten, terse apologies. 2 weeks later, a work crew appeared and unceremoniously dismantled the Welcome to Lakeview Estates sign. About 2 months after that, a for sale sign went up in front of Beatrice Hayes's house. I heard they moved to a gated community, 2 counties over one, with a very real, very powerful HOA. I suspect she's finally found her people. Our neighborhood is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's not the tense silence of people trying to avoid a local despot. It's the peaceful, easy quiet of a true community. We formed a real neighborhood social committee, voluntary, of course. The Garcias are on the board. We had a block party last month, and for the first time, it felt like everyone was there. Arthur even brought his famous grilled tomatoes. Every now and then, someone will stop me on my walk and thank me. I just nod and tell them I'm glad it worked out. I'm happy in my quiet retirement. But I have to admit, every time I look at my perfectly legal, unapproved decorative garden border and my non-regulation rose bushes, I feel a small, grim flicker of professional satisfaction. And that's how I accidentally dismantled a non-existent HOA with a single badge, a well-organized PowerPoint, and a healthy dose of righteous indignation. The moral of the story? Never, ever underestimate the quiet retiree down the street. You just never know who they used to be.